Today, a federal government agency in Canada released new information about inflation in Canada, particularly the inflation rate in August of this year. So where inflation is at over the last few months. And it was not good news. I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. The cost of living keeps increasing, and the data that was released today shows that this is still at generationally high levels with no end in sight. In fact, the data released today showed that food prices are at some of their highest in terms of inflation in nearly 41 years. That's a huge problem. And I want to talk to you about these numbers and what they mean if somebody's talking to you about them, and some potentially really bad news that could affect this in October, and why it's so important with Parliament resuming this week for the government to come up with a plan. So the inflation data that was released today, it was dependent on, some of you might notice that there was a very small decrease in fuel costs over the last couple of months. Still, fuel prices are way higher than they were a year ago, certainly 2 years ago. But that small little bit of relief, there's potentially some bad news coming on that. OPEC, the cartel that produces a lot of the world's oil, that they get together and they set how much they're going to produce. They said that in October they're going to cut production of oil. And what does that mean? Well, if you cut production of something that everybody needs, what happens to prices? It increases, right? So a lot of people are going to be talking about these inflation numbers today. They're still really record high, and every news article talks about, like, okay, well, you know, any little bit of decrease in the cost of living is due to this very small decrease in fuel costs that still are super higher than they were over a year ago. If that's the argument that they're making, there's a big problem coming, because in October, if OPEC carries through with this production decrease, then what happens to fuel prices? Obviously, they're going to increase. And again, because the Trudeau Liberals have, just been fighting so hard against Canada's energy industry, we're now less resilient than we used to be in terms of future outlook on Canada's energy security, right? It means we're more dependent on international oil production in terms of supply shock. So that is not great news. The other thing that's not really great news about this is, many of you know what's happened. Interest rates have increased. The cost of borrowing money has dramatically increased. And the Bank of Canada has made the cost of borrowing more expensive to do what? They say to decrease inflation, to fight inflation. Well, those numbers today, they don't show a big budge. They don't show that increase of the cost of borrowing is actually helping the cost of living. And why? It's because the products that you need, like bread or whatever, there's still a lot of shortages, and we have these big supply chain issues and structural issues that are causing these prices to increase. So the Liberals, they might be hoping that the cost of borrowing is going to somehow magically fix generationally high inflation, but when in fact that's not what the data is showing. In fact, it's making harder for Canadians to pay bills. It's making the housing crisis probably even worse, right? So what do we need to do? How can we fix this? Well, today Parliament resumed, and even though Justin Trudeau wasn't in the House today, Conservatives are focused on trying to get a plan for this. And you're going to hear us talking a lot about things like the carbon tax and other taxes that are affecting the input cost, or the cost of producing the things that you need to buy. Because if those input costs are lower, what happens? Well, inflation potentially decreases too, right? And also it might be easier for Canadian manufacturers, farmers, agricultural producers to produce more of those goods, or be incented to do that, so that we have a bigger supply of the things that you need, which hopefully will help address inflation. And it's those structural issues that we need to be addressing. The government, for the last couple of years, they've been saying, like, oh, inflation is a problem everywhere. It's not a big deal. But there are unique issues in Canada that are making our inflationary problems, that cost of living problem, more acute, that we could address. And that's why we're trying to come up with solutions that make it easier for Canadian manufacturers, again, farmers, etc., to produce the goods you need so that they are more affordable. This is what a responsible government does. The other thing is we know that because the government has been spending so much money, that has had an impact on inflation as well too. So you're going to also hear us talking about things like, listen, federal government, listen, Liberal government, we shouldn't be spending as a country money without figuring out where that money is going to come from, right? And you'll hear our new party leader talking about this in terms of the government should not be spending anything without figuring out where that money is coming from existing spending. And we know that the federal government is spending money on really dumb things. Like, I mean, just one example out of so many, the We Charity scandal, right? That was what, nearly $1 billion, over $1 billion? So again, this is so important. But what I want you to do is to share this video, because if people are talking about, oh, the cost of living or these inflation numbers, there's a few things you have to be able to talk about. And again, this is sort of beyond political stripe. Number one, that the inflationary numbers that came out today, that data from August, number one, we're still seeing generationally high inflation. You know this from going out and trying to buy stuff like this, right? It's expensive. Number two, that food costs are at generationally high levels, right? Like the data today shows that food prices are the highest they've been since I was 1 year old. And that's a long time ago, I hate to say. Number three, the government doesn't really have a plan to address this. And they're relying on the Bank of Canada increasing the cost of borrowing money to stop inflation. But that's not, the data is not showing that that's actually making a dent. Number four, the government doesn't have a plan to deal with some of these, what we call structural issues, these broader issues on why we're not producing enough goods or getting the sufficient quantity of cheap goods in order to address inflation. That's where we're talking about things like removing the carbon tax or addressing this fertilizer tariff, those sorts of things, right? In the longer term, the federal government needs to address things that affect inflation, like labor issues, like these broader supply chain issues. I could go on, but the bottom line is that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, do you see any of their cabinet ministers, any of their MPs putting out videos like this? No. This should be the number one issue, though, that they're looking at, and they're hoping that this is just going to go away on its own, and this data shows that it won't. So share this video. Demand a plan from the federal Liberals. That's what we're doing in the House of Commons today. We are demanding a plan as the official opposition. We've got some suggestions that we've put out there. This needs to be the number one priority of the federal Liberal government, not singing at a piano bar. Working hard for you in Ottawa. Share this video. Have a great day.